Breathing in, I can hear my voice over the loudspeakers. Can you hear it too? Okay, breathing out, the whole sound team can relax, and me. So, let us just sit comfortably and enjoy 3 sounds of the bell. Dear respected teacher, dear friends, dear beloved community, today is the 23rd of September in the year 2021. Good, I got that right. And we're in the upper hamlet of Plum village for our day of mindfulness today as part of our Rains Retreat 2021. And we are here with, 40, 50 people. We're here for the 90-day retreat, and we are also joined online by, I think, an ever-increasing number of friends, I think around 1,500 now. So it's truly a Dharma festival, and it's a wonderful thing to be practicing all together like this, supporting each other. So today I want to share a little bit about healing. And it's a very challenging topic. It's challenging for me because I have to ask myself, what right do I have to share about healing? Am I healed? Can I only share about healing if I'm completely healed, all done? If that were the case, then I would not be here sharing with you today. No, I feel like actually one of the most important things for me in the journey of healing is to change my mindset, my attitude towards healing. I think I came to Plum Village with the idea that healing is something that is going to happen suddenly, and then all done, it'll all be good. I'm waiting for that one big cathartic moment of understanding, of enlightenment, and then I'll be able to relax, everything will be fine. And also there's maybe the attitude that somebody else is going to give me that, whether it's a therapist or a teacher, or even a book, a sutra, or an experience. Maybe even a pill or a drug. We may be waiting still for that big moment, that big event that's going to change everything. And I think that attitude itself may prevent us from healing, from being on the path of healing. So, I'd like to start with kind of like an overview of what I hope to share with you today. So, if we're going to talk about healing, then I think we have to talk about suffering. We have to be able to name it. We have to be able to identify it. And we want to understand the relationship between our individual and our collective suffering. And then, of course, we want to find healing, or the path of healing. So that might involve some strategies. So it's very interesting to me that very often when we speak about suffering, or when I speak about suffering with friends, quite often the first thing that they'll say is, well, I don't suffer. So what's the point of this whole Buddhism business? I don't have any suffering, so, everything's fine, especially if we're relatively well off, comfortable, we have a good job, everything's fine. What's the problem? So we have to define our terms a little bit. What do we actually mean by suffering? What kind of suffering are we talking about? And there's a difference perhaps between the sort of classical Buddhist definition of suffering and what we have to encounter now in this moment of our history. So classically, you probably all know the story about the Buddha as a young man being protected in the palace and never having to encounter any suffering. Not sure about that, but anyway, that's how the story goes. And then he sort of sneaks out of the palace and he, for the first time in his life, sees, I can't remember in what order, but he sees somebody who's sick. He goes, oh my goodness, there is sickness. Wow, that's bad. Then he sees somebody who has died. Wow, death is a thing. Who knew? And then somebody who's old, they don't happy, they're struggling with being old. And maybe he sees somebody giving birth, right? That's the four, right? Birth, old age, sickness, and death. That's the classical, these are the sufferings that we have to understand and encounter in our life. Well, that may be still true to a certain extent, especially now in COVID times, sickness, death, yeah. Birth may be maybe involves less suffering now than it did in the past. There's a lot less childhood, infant mortality. There's a lot less death in childbirth. May still involve quite a lot of pain. But in general, it's a lot safer. And old age, well, we tend to live a lot longer, probably healthy and active for longer. But it's still challenging, and we tend to prefer to ignore it. We have a tendency in our society to not want to look too closely at old age, because there's kind of discomfort that comes up with that. I remember in 2003 there was a heat wave in France and probably in most of Europe, and many people died. I think it was in the tens of thousands of people who died because of that heat wave, and many of them were old and living alone. And I was in Plum village at the time, and I remember Tai sharing with us about this event and helping us to bear witness to to what we've become as a society. What really shocked Tai, and I think what shocked the world, is that not only did many of these elderly people die alone, either because of dehydration or heat stroke, because they were living in an apartment somewhere up in an apartment block without enough ventilation, or whatever the specific causes were. They died alone, so their children were not there to support them and look after them. But not only that, when their deaths were reported to the family, in many cases the children denied any responsibility. They didn't want to take care of the funeral arrangements. They said, "It's not my problem. I don't want to deal with it." And there's a kind of wake-up call in that we have come to the point where many of us might disown our own parents and claim that we have no responsibility and not our problem. Yes, so maybe in old age there is still some suffering for us to look at. But also, of course, we all recognize that there are events in life which are traumatic, difficult, painful, and that's the moment where we go and seek help. Often, when we have a breakdown, something goes wrong, we lose our job, or we have bereavement, or sudden awareness of our own mortality or ill health, And so, of course, there are these kind of emergencies that then make us look again at how we're living and seek help, perhaps, and solutions. But I think it's also very important, before those dramatic events, to look at the kind of low-grade background stress that we might be experiencing, and to start to recognize that there may be some kind of subtle, more or less subtle, suffering that we're experiencing every day. And so we want to know how to deal with things like stress, chronic stress, anxiety. And this can be kind of climate anxiety as well, existential anxiety for our species, or for other species. There can be a sense of despair and powerlessness to do anything to remedy the situation. We might want to also look at addiction. Addiction and compulsion. These are forces in our lives that when you look closely at it, you realize that there's an experience of suffering in the present moment. A lack of freedom. There's also, of course, the suffering that arises from discrimination. discrimination, and inequality. The list could go on, obviously. So we want to have a way to meet these feelings in our daily life. We know from psychologists that suppressing uncomfortable, unpleasant feelings doesn't work in the long term. Of course, we can all cover up, to a certain extent, our own feelings of discomfort and pain, and these days modern society offers us many, many ways to do that. But what we know from psychologists is that this active suppression of the feelings, it leads to avoidance behaviors. And it can also push us into cycles of compulsion and addiction. And I think we have to be careful not to normalize that in our society as well. It's very interesting. Let's talk about streaming services, right? Watching stuff, episode after episode after episode, whether it's movies or series or whatever, binge watching. Okay, that's a phenomenon now in our society. And it's weird, I find it strange, the extent to which we're normalizing it. We're making it kind of almost cool. But we wouldn't do that with eating, right? You see in the newspapers or online, there's kind of like, your summer binge-watching guide. Have you seen that? It's amazing. It's like, what to binge watch this July? But you wouldn't, you'd be a bit shocked if it said, your summer binge eating guide. But that would be a bit weird, right? So why is it okay when it's binge watching? It's just something to reflect. We live in a time, I think, where there is a sense of possibly impending doom. Right? When you know a little bit about what's happening to our climate, it's hard to feel optimistic about the future. And that knowledge in itself is very uncomfortable. So of course, mostly we just don't want to feel that discomfort. So it's very natural to want to avoid that feeling in any way we possibly can, to cover it up. But we also know that that doesn't work very well long term, and it leads to feelings of guilt and even more powerlessness and even more despair and even more doom. So we need to, if we're going to heal, we need to find ways of healing that address that as well, that address the real feelings that we're facing, individually and collectively. Because there's a relationship between our individual avoidance behaviors and the collective problem of the heating planet, right? Watching YouTube video after YouTube video doesn't have a zero cost in terms of carbon emissions. It's actually very significant. The cost of maintaining the heating, the cooling of all the server farms in the world to be able to continue delivering all that video content to our screens is very significant. So electricity and heat. And we know that pretty much every kind of avoidance behavior has its own carbon footprint, has its own cost. It's part of the problem. And we are maybe caught in a cycle of procrastination as individuals and as a society. We know that the situation is urgent. We know that we need to do something. We know we need to change, but sometimes that knowledge itself is so overwhelming that we can't deal with it, so we want to hide. And we engage in more avoidance behaviors, which leads to the situation being even more overwhelming and even more unbearable, which leads to more avoidance behaviors and so on. And so we want to change that pattern. So you might find it odd that I start off by talking about healing and I end up talking about climate change, but for me, we cannot separate these two. There isn't going to be any individual healing unless we address the elephant in the room, which is our collective responsibility and our collective role in the destruction of this planet. So when we look at the problem of climate change, or now what is known as maybe climate disruption, climate catastrophe, climate emergency, we maybe need to change the language to remember that it is a little more urgent than we thought. But there are three core elements to approaching the problem. So we know from experts in the field that the first thing we have to do, obviously, is reduce emissions, and that's known as mitigation. So we mitigate the causes of the problem, we stop causing the problem. Then the second part of that is, the second part of the solution is preparing our infrastructure to be resilient. So transforming our cities, our homes, to be able to cope with increased temperatures and so on. That's adaptation. So mitigation and adaptation. But what I want to talk about is the third aspect of the solution, which I believe we as a spiritual community and as practitioners can play a very active role in. And that is, so I'm quoting here from a book which is called A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety by Sarah Jaquette Ray. It's a really excellent book. So this third part of the solution, she says, is building the capacity of people to cope with the traumas and toxic stresses generated by rising temperatures, and learning to use them as catalysts to learn, grow, and increase personal and collective well-being and the condition of the natural environment. It's a little bit long, maybe I'll read it again. So building the capacity of people, that's us, to cope with the traumas and chronic toxic stresses generated by rising temperatures, and use them as catalysts to learn, grow, and increase personal and collective well-being and the condition of the natural environment. So, to sum it all up, it's basically developing resilience, individual and collective resilience. And that's really at the heart of what I want to talk about today. And I think it's somewhere that we can really each be asking ourselves, what can I do to contribute to this part of the solution? Because it's very painful to feel powerless, to feel like there's nothing that we can do. We just feel worse and worse. So what I want to share with you today is that there is a lot that we can do, especially as spiritual practitioners who have access to this incredible stream of wisdom and practice from our spiritual ancestors. We are very, very lucky. We're very fortunate because we actually have something to offer, and it is a very significant something. It's significant because, there's a lot of work going into mitigation. There's a lot of work going into adaptation, but there's not enough perhaps going into the work of building resilience, building our ability to deal with the traumas and the stresses that arise, that are already arising. So of course, it's not just learning how to deal with those traumas and stresses in ourselves, but it's being able to help others. That's the training. That's what we're up to. Because when we are able to heal ourselves and develop that personal resilience, we become much better able to help those around us. And we're going to need every single one of us to do that work. It's something to contemplate. It's something to... Each of us can ask ourselves, when we think about our lives, what do we really want? What do we really want to do with our lives? What is the thing that makes our heart sing? And what's beautiful for me is that I find that there's so much space for me in this path of learning to deal with toxic stress and trauma and pain, learning how to metabolize it, transform it into joy and peace, resilience, and love, compassion. There's so much space for me to be me, to find ways to bring what I have to bear on the problem. So I'm a musician, and I find immediately, okay, that's the only meaningful thing I can do with these talents that I've received from my ancestors. That's how I can see that there's a point to being a musician right now in this moment of our history, because I believe that can help us. That can help us to solve exactly this problem. But I think each one of us can find out, can look inside and see, how can I play a role in this great transformation of our society, in this great kind of learning of, it's a kind of growing up that we have to do as a society, that we learn how to metabolize suffering. It's a beautiful thing. It's a wonderful thing that we get to be a part of that. Our friends Joe Confino and Taifap Hu the other day had an interview with Joanna Macy for the Plum podcast. And she said something really extraordinary. She said she has so much gratitude to be alive now, in this moment of planetary crisis. She said that for her, in this moment, bodhisattvas all over the cosmos are lining up to be born here on planet Earth right now in this moment, because this is the moment where we can do something. This is the moment where we can contribute, to be part of that learning, that evolution, that transformation. In the moment of crisis, that's where we can be of service. That's where we can offer our being, our talents, our heart, our compassion, our love. So yes, it's hard. It's a hard moment, but it's also a wonderful moment. It's a moment of opportunity. And that's part of the healing. That's the shift in our attitude. The shift in our attitude towards the suffering. That we start to see it as an opportunity for growth. We move from being a victim to being in the process of growth, of learning, of awakening. So, it's relevant what we're doing here. You know, when you sit on your cushion in the morning, or you go for walking meditation, it's relevant. It's relevant to the global situation. It's not self-indulgent. You know, it's not hiding from the problem. It's part of the solution, and a very, very important part. So, let's enjoy a sound of the bell. So, what can happen, when we think about the process of healing, is that the question comes up, well, what should I do? How do I do it? And we're very eager to do something. But I think maybe it might be more important to look at the preconditions of healing than to jump too quickly into I want to fix it. Tell me what to do. So what are the preconditions of healing? In our tradition, we talk about stopping. Shamatha. And looking deeply. Vipassana. Might need some help with the spelling here. Something like that. Maybe 2 S's. And what I've noticed in my interactions with practitioners over the years is that we're very eager to do this. We want to go straight into this. I want to, unravel it all. I want to get into the guts of my suffering, understand it, and that's what's going to work. I'm going to look into it. But maybe we haven't invested enough in this. This is really what I want to talk about today. So, this stopping, what do we mean? Stopping what? Somehow, what we are talking about is stopping the constant running. The feeling that this moment isn't enough, that I need to get to the next moment and the next thing, the next satisfying activity, or even understanding or breakthrough or healing, whatever it is, but it's somewhere next. It's not this. There's something dissatisfying about this. I don't like it. I want something else. This is not what I ordered. I wanted a milkshake, not French fries. Why did you bring me this? I don't like it. I want something else. There's something that pushes us out of the present moment. That's like shoving us all the time. And when we stop, actually the first thing that happens is that we encounter that force. And actually, it's not that pleasant. So, sorry about this. This is usually we put this in the fine print, okay? Usually the message is, stop and enjoy the wonders of life, the healing and nourishing, and that's true, also true. But what we sometimes don't emphasize so much is that actually what happens when you stop is the first thing you feel is, I don't want this. And so it's hard. It's actually not that easy. You need some kind of enlightenment already, some kind of awakening, just to have the determination to stop, to actually do it, and not to get pushed immediately by our own discomfort. So, in this stopping, we may need to do some calming, first of all. We may need to be able to soothe ourselves, just as a very first step. And it's amazing that we have the ability as mammals to soothe ourselves. It's a kind of incredible gift of evolution that we can do this. And one of the easiest ways to do it is just to bring our awareness back to the breath. Just your breathing plus your awareness is soothing. So yes, there may be some discomfort there, but with the mindful breathing, with the awareness of the sensations in the body, of our feet on the ground, we start to have some capacity to be with that discomfort. And in that calming, we get to do maybe 3 things. We get to recognize. We have to recognize our own discomfort, our own ill-being. We have to kind of own up to it. And we are fundamentally averse to discomfort. So there's a natural disinclination to do this. We don't really want to admit it. But that's the first step, just to recognize and to accept. I have to accept, yes, this is discomfort. I don't like it. But it's okay. It's not life-threatening. Although the first impulse might be, it's so unpleasant, it's so uncomfortable that I can't bear it. This is especially true if you're trying to break a habit. Let's say, for example, and I'm not saying that anybody here does, but let's say that you have the habit of binge watching something. This can be applied to any kind of habit. But everything is set up to enable you to just continue, right? Auto next, play next thing automatically. That's what all of these services try to do. They want you to keep watching. So they make it very easy. The thing that's hard is to stop. And we all know that if we don't stop, that behavior will have a cost in the long term. In the short term, maybe you feel okay because you feel kind of nothing, you feel kind of numb. But in the long term, it's going to affect your sleep, it's going to affect maybe your job, maybe even your relationships, maybe your exercise, your eating. It has a lot of consequences. But the act of stopping, of switching it off, of saying stop, may actually bring up a lot of discomfort. Because the first thing that happens is, what have I been doing with my life? Why am I wasting my time like this? Oh my goodness, this feels horrible. I should just watch another episode not to feel this. And then the problem gets worse. So there's some discomfort involved in the stopping. We need to know how to calm our nervous system, to recognize, to accept, and to embrace this discomfort. What does that look like? That ability to embrace. Sometimes we have the capacity naturally, and that's wonderful. But what do you do if you don't? If on that day, in that moment, it feels like this is too much. I can't embrace this. This suffering is too much for me to handle. It's too painful. I can't deal with it. I just want to cover it up. Then we need help. We need to know how to find that capacity to embrace the difficulty. And one way, which I really invite you to try, is to expand your frame of reference. So it's true that when an uncomfortable feeling is present, if it's just me that has to hold it, that has to deal with it, it may well be too much. I may well be unable to deal with it. But what if I'm not just this? What if instead I am this? The earth, the sky, space, the stars. Then I have some capacity. And that is not just an act of wishful thinking or imagination. That's actually the truth. That is what we are. But we need to train ourselves in order to make that a reflex. Because we have the reflex when we suffer of contracting. This is very, very normal. When we feel some difficulty, some pain, we contract around it. We actually make ourselves smaller, and we feel that the pain is everything that we are. It occupies our whole being, and it is, of course, overwhelming. So we need to establish some space around it. The first thing we can do is actually to establish that space within our own body. to find that maybe this pain and this discomfort that I feel actually doesn't occupy the whole of me. A little bit of the spirit of investigation, of curiosity, to start to notice, oh, okay, what about my fingertips? What about my hands? Are they feeling this overwhelming nausea and sense of despair? Not really. Feel quite nice. It's a real thing, that there's a difference between maybe what we feel here and what we feel in our hands, in our feet, in our face. So we expand the sphere of our awareness, of our mindfulness. We start to include more in the field of our awareness. And we can go further. We know, intellectually we know, right, that we are vast in time and space. Intellectually you know that you are the continuation of your ancestors. That all of your ancestors in some sense are present with you, now, in you, in every cell of your body. But there's a big difference between that intellectual understanding and a lived experience of that as a place of refuge, as a place of strength. So it's something that we need to cultivate. You can't just turn it on all of a sudden and that's that. You know, of course you may have a kind of breakthrough experience in touching the earth and you suddenly see it and you feel it in your whole body and it's amazing. But then you need to cultivate that. We need to make it a habit to invoke the strength and the stability, the security of our entire lineage. And not just blood, but our spiritual lineage. Our friends. And the whole of the history of evolution. The truth is that we are survivors. We're not weak, we are strong. Every single one of us is the product of an unbroken chain of survivors. Every single one of our ancestors lived to the moment of reproduction, at least. Otherwise we wouldn't be here. So they survived everything that history threw at them. That's amazing, because so many didn't. We have all of that strength in us. Not just our human ancestors, but going back further. All the way back. That's in the dimension of time, but also in the dimension of space. Now, in this moment. We know intellectually that we cannot live, that a part of our life is the forest. It's our lungs. Part of our life is the sun. If the sun were to vanish this instant, how long would life survive on this planet? It would get very cold very quickly and very dark. You know, we could burn all the oil reserves and maybe survive a little bit, huddled around whatever we could burn. But we would not last very long. The sun is part of our body. The oceans, the forests, the air, the insects, the fungi, even the bacteria. We we're in this constant relationship of exchange. And if we can take that from being just something that we get intellectually, sure, to being a lived awareness, something that you can actually feel and experience, then our ability to hold and to embrace pain changes. It makes a real difference, and I invite you to experiment with this, to actually try. The next time you have to face a difficult emotion, and I hope that is not soon, but you never know, next time it happens, try to remember, who is holding this feeling? Is it just me? Is it just this narrative self that I have constructed with a name and an identity and a birth certificate and qualifications and personal life history? Or is it more? Feel the earth under your feet. Is the earth small? No. It's vast. And it's part of you. You are the earth. The earth is you. It's not outside of you. And it dramatically changes your ability to hold the discomfort, the pain. It's something to experiment with. And sit there. It feels unbearable. But then you remember, I'm not just this. What if I allow the trees, the sky, the sunlight, the grass, the earth under me, the air, to be part of this embracing? And it actually is. It's not your imagination. This is actually what is happening. But we need to let it in. Dear friends, I think this is a good moment to have a little stretching break. Need a little more energy. So please, if you would, stand. And maybe you can raise your arms up and interlock the fingers. And maybe look up. Feel your connection with the ground from the soles of the feet reaching up to the sky. Breathe in, and then with the out-breath you can slowly release everything down to the earth. Soft knees. Just let everything hang. Relax the neck, relax the face. Still feeling your connection with the earth, the weight. And then slowly rolling up from the base of the spine. Maybe we can do some side stretches. To one side, feel the distance increasing between all the ribs, feel the connection to the ground. And the other side, see if you can create space all up the side of your body. Release the arms and maybe just let the arms swing and bounce on the knees a little bit. Bounce every swing. Just let the arms be very loose, shoulders very open. Just shake it all out. Don't have to be too serious. Okay. Maybe hands can give them a little shake like this. Shake out the feet. Yes, and you can smile. All right. Let's, if you will, have a seat. So, when we can stop, when we can calm ourselves, when we have the courage to recognize, to accept and to embrace whatever it is that we're feeling, then we have a chance to rest. And resting doesn't just mean lying down on your bed. The invitation here is to experience resting in every moment. So in Plum Village we like to practice walking meditation. Tai always used to say that there's only one style of walking in Plum Village, which is walking meditation. And we, those of us who are in Plum Village, we need to make that true. Right? That's our responsibility. It's not just something that's on the breakfast table that you can spread on your bread, you know. It's something that we have to make true. And if you consider yourself part of the wider Plum Village community, you can make that true where you are as well. So, in walking meditation, the invitation is to turn on our sensitivity, to become, to make our whole foot alive, to actually feel the contact with the ground, to feel every subtlety, every aspect of that contact. To feel like with every step we kiss Mother Earth. With that kind of sensitivity and care and love in every step. That's a very different way of walking. The invitation is to feel that with every step we can arrive. Arrive. We can feel that we are at home. No longer chasing after something in the future. Fully present. And free. Free because we're not being pushed anymore. We've been able to stop. Even though we're still walking, we've stopped. Stopped chasing after the next thing. We're happy with this step. This moment. This moment of arriving and resting. When you feel very tired, when you feel overwhelmed, try walking meditation. You don't have to only lie down to rest. You can rest in every step. You can feel that in this step, I give back. I release all of my stress, all of my tiredness, my exhaustion, my overwhelm. I let it go. I give it back to Mother Earth. And Mother Earth is more than capable of receiving it. She has no problem. She can handle it. try to experience that. Resting in every step. And also when we sit in meditation, sitting should not be a struggle. We are very conditioned to struggle, to try to get something. And we can transfer that conditioning of trying to acquire, trying to be good at, trying to do well, we can transfer all of that to the practice of sitting meditation. And then sitting meditation becomes a constant struggle. Feeling of, I should be able to do it better. I'm not good enough. So instead, maybe we can experience in the sitting, resting. And the resting is a precondition for healing. The amazing thing about the healing is that it's not really something that you have to do. It's something that you have to allow. Your body, your mind, your heart, they know very well how to heal. But maybe we have learned not to trust and to look for external solutions. So the healing isn't necessarily about doing more, finding another fix, even another therapy. It might be about doing less, much less. And this is another aspect of stopping. Creating space, saying no. And there's an aspect of freedom in that. We have this part of our brain called the frontal lobes, right? The neocortex and the frontal lobes, and that's generally what's thought to be the part of our brain that distinguishes us from other animals. It's what gives us all of our cherished human characteristics. Language and theory of mind and self-consciousness. The ability to ask big questions. And so, at least for me, when I first learned about the frontal lobes and the neocortex, I sort of thought this must be a part of the brain where there's a lot of kind of intense processing going on and choosing, and that's where my kind of agency comes from and my freedom, my free will. That's what makes me, me. That's my kind of conscious mind. Turns out this is not really true. And I don't know whether you're aware, but in these days there's a big debate. There has been an ongoing debate for many centuries, but particularly now there's a debate about free will. Do we actually have free will? And generally speaking, the scientific and philosophical consensus is no, we don't. It's very strange. Even Einstein believed that we don't have any kind of free will at all. That everything is just the playing out of causes and conditions of essentially a mechanical universe, just operating according to physical law, and all we have is the illusion of choice, the illusion of free will. Now, that doesn't feel very inspiring. I mean, it's not a very uplifting outlook, and yet it is the commonly held outlook by most modern philosophers and scientists. Not everyone, but the majority. And what is very often cited as part of the evidence for us not having this free will is a series of experiments that were done about sort of voluntary action. So there was a guy called Liebet. Charles Liebet? I don't remember his first name. Anyway, so he did these experiments in around 1985, and they're EEG So he put electrodes on the scalp, and then what he was looking at was the sort of voluntary control of the hand. And what they found, and this was already known in the past, was that there's something called a readiness potential, which happens about 1 second before the movement. So you can see something happening in the brain, which is sort of preparing the movement about 1 second before. And we already knew that. But what he was surprised by, and what everybody was surprised by, was that the self-reported moment of conscious volition, of choosing to move the hand or not, was about 0.2 seconds after the readiness potential was measured in the brain. So it seemed like the body and the brain already knew what the person was going to choose to do. Right? So it seems like the part of us that we think is choosing is just kind of after the fact. It's an illusion of choice. The decision's already made, and we're just kind of telling ourselves a story that I chose to move. But in fact, you can see evidence in the brain and the kind of muscle preparation that the choice had already been made. And so those experiments have been refined and repeated over the decades since then. And I think the most recent one found up to 7 seconds sort of evidence of movement priming before the decision, so-called decision. There's an enormous amount of time in neurological terms. 7 seconds before your body already knows what you're going to choose to do. So everybody then cites this and says, well, you see, we don't have any free will, it's all an illusion. But it's not quite as simple as that. So it turns out that our frontal lobes, most of what they do is not initiating, it's inhibiting. Very strange. So we usually think of inhibiting as something negative, but in fact, so this is Joseph Ledoux, who's a very well-known researcher in the field, and he says the cortex's job is to prevent the inappropriate response rather than to produce the appropriate one. So in fact, the whole of the brain and the body is constantly producing impulses, things that you could do, and the cortex's job is to say no, 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 and sometimes not to say no. Right? Which is also not initiating, it's just, okay, this time I won't say no, and then the action happens. So out of all the many, many impulses, mostly what you are, this kind of amazing frontal lobe is doing is to say no, I won't. And the interesting thing is that actually between the readiness potential and the decision, there is time for the frontal lobes to intervene and to veto the impulse. So there's a readiness potential, you're priming, you're getting ready to act, but you still have time to say no, I won't. And that's very interesting for us as practitioners. Very interesting. There's a zone of freedom. And it may be small. It may be very small at first. I think, to a large extent, the philosophers and scientists are actually correct. Mostly, we do not have free will. Mostly, we have the illusion of free will. Mostly, but not completely. Think of when you're watching a movie, and let's say it's a really good movie, and it's really engaging, and you're really kind of like involved in the story. In that event, you have no freedom. You don't choose anything. But you feel like the people, the characters in the film, are all free. They're choosing. They have free will. They're like you. But if you stop for a moment and reflect, you know it's all scripted, it's all been recorded, every frame, every action, every response, all preordained. It's all been decided in advance. But you still feel like everybody in the story is free. They're choosing. You know that they're not, but you feel like they are. Because you don't know what's going to happen next. Right? You don't know what's going to come, so you feel like, it's still open. Anything could happen. Even if it's actually very predictable what's going to happen. The hero's going to win, they're going to save the world, everything will be fine. You know exactly what's going to happen, but you feel like anything could happen. So it's just an example, but maybe that example can shed light on our daily life. That maybe actually that's how we spend most of our daily life. Just being, kind of pushed, conditioned, prodded, primed by what we consume, by our interactions, by our own impulses. But we feel free because we don't know what's going to happen next. But actually we're just sort of, a ball rolling along a channel. Mostly. So it's just an example, something to reflect on. So what freedom could we have? Well, when you're watching the movie, the freedom you have is to turn it off, to say no, to say stop. And in our normal daily life, the freedom maybe that we have is to notice the impulse and go, oh, I don't have to. Amazing. There's an impulse, it may be strong, and then you go, oh, but I don't have to do it. I'll give you an example. Early on in my monastic life, there was a situation in Vietnam which involved a large number of our brothers and sisters who were being targeted by the government, and it was a very tense situation. The whole monastery in the highlands was surrounded by police, although it wasn't acknowledged that they were police, and there were lots of rumors and speculation, but essentially they were being cut off. Their electricity was cut off, the gas was cut off, the water was cut off, and they lived like that for 3 months or more, and people were trying to find ways to smuggle bottles of water in, throwing them over the fence, and they were collecting rainwater, and it was a whole drama. Anyway, a number of us had to go to the EU Parliament and the Commission for Human Rights to try to raise awareness of the situation and to see if we could intervene in some way. And it happened that I was part of that delegation, and I was in this particular day, I was in a meeting with some of these people, and Sister Chen Kong and a number of other brothers and sisters. We were sitting around a table, and we were trying to share the story of what we knew was really happening on the ground in Vietnam. And so Sister Chan Kong was sharing, maybe one of my sisters shared very eloquently, and I wanted to share something. And I noticed the impulse. I really wanted to share. But perhaps because I had been practicing mindfulness, I'd been doing my walking meditation, my sitting meditation, so I had a kind of reserve. I had a little more awareness. That gave me more time. The zone of freedom was a little bit more than usual, so I could notice the impulse. Now, this is interesting because we speak about our conscious mind, right, what is in the realm of our conscious mind, and my sense with the practice is that we can expand into what may usually be unconscious impulses and drives. We start to become aware of them, we start to notice them. And that's not always pleasant. right? You may start to notice some things you don't much like the look of. And in this particular instance, there I was sitting there, and I noticed this impulse. And the first thing is to think, yeah, and I should share. This is important. I have something important to say. It's significant. I've got to share it. But then I noticed something, like a quality in that impulse, something that I kind of felt pushed by it. And I think with the practice, what we develop is an aversion to being pushed around, including by ourselves. Right? It's like you get the smell of it, you get the savor of compulsion. And when you recognize it, when you see it coming, you're like, no, not anymore. I say stop. And because I had that little bit more mindfulness than usual, I could see it coming, I could be aware of its quality, I could see that there's this element of compulsion in it, and I got to have a look. What is really going on? And what I found out was that in that moment, what I wanted was not just to contribute an important point to the discussion and, help my brothers and sisters in Vietnam. No. What I wanted was to be recognized. I wanted these strangers, these people who were sort of important, politicians, EU ministers or whatever, that I wanted them to think I was intelligent, basically. It's kind of not very beautiful. But that's what I saw. I suddenly realized, I'm in a room with people I don't know, and the first thing I want to do is make sure that they know I'm intelligent. Ugh, yuck. Right? It's yuck. It's really yucky. But I saw it. And I saw that maybe my whole life I've been doing that. I'm not accustomed to being in the background. I'm not accustomed to being in a room and sort of not contributing or not saying anything. I'm not used to that. So when I'm in that situation, it's very uncomfortable. And the first thing I want to do is get in there and say something impressive. And then everyone's like, oh yeah, this guy, he's really got something to offer. Or whatever. It doesn't even go that far, but it's an impulse, right? But I saw it. And because I saw it, because I recognized this flavor of compulsion, of kind of addictive, that little fix, that little dopamine hit I was going to get, I saw it, I could catch it, and I could say, stop. Don't need to. What a relief. What a relief. And of course there's some discomfort in the initial act of resistance. It is an act of resistance. And this may be the kind of resistance that we need to engage in. To resist the compulsion, whatever it is. But when I could endure that discomfort, there's some discomfort, then what I found is relief. Wow. There's actually a joy that comes from being free, from being able to say no. And that joy and that freedom is not experienced only by you. It is your entire lineage. Because that compulsion didn't just come from me. That's my parents and my grandparents and my ancestors, and they've all been doing that for how many generations? Like a freight train of habit, which is bearing down on me in that moment. And what makes the difference whether I have the strength or not to say stop to that immense force coming down is whether or not I've been maintaining my daily practice. That's really what's going to make a difference. So when you ask yourself in the day-to-day practice, sometimes you don't feel inspired to go to walking meditation or sitting meditation, or you feel like, I don't know, what difference does it make? I go again and again, be aware of my steps. And sometimes, you don't feel inspired. But just remember, every single moment of mindfulness, of just recognizing what is going on now,
in my sensations, in my feelings, in my mind, my perceptions. Everything that you can recognize is going to be strengthening that reserve, increasing that reserve of mindfulness, and that is what will make the difference. That is your freedom in the difficult moments. So invest in mindfulness. Invest in your own freedom with every step. There's something not very appealing about the word restraint, especially in our society these days. There's a lot of there's a kind of push towards everything's fine. Don't judge me. Don't shame me. Let me do whatever I want. Everything's cool. Don't be so annoying. Just leave me alone. I need to follow my heart. I can do whatever I want. That's freedom. The freedom to, right? Freedom to do, to choose, to believe, to do whatever you want. Freedom to. And the advertisers are very invested in convincing us that this is a good kind of freedom for us to have, that we should have the freedom of choice, the freedom to choose whatever kind of breakfast cereal you want out of 200 options. But what is the experience of that freedom to, actually? If you stand there in front of the shelf in the supermarket and, qualitatively investigate your experience in that moment, standing there, check in with your body. You're trying to choose, which brand of coffee, which brand of whatever, soap, For me, the experience is anxiety and bewilderment. It's viscerally unpleasant. And the advertisers want me to believe that they're doing me a favor. We're just giving you more choice. Isn't that what you want? That's what, and they keep telling us, that's what consumers want. They want choice. I mean, yes, up to a point. I'm not saying I don't want any choice, right? But I don't know if that's where my freedom comes from. So what I'm suggesting is that we can cultivate a kind of freedom which can never be taken away from us. Political freedom can come and go. It'll come and go. Right now maybe we're lucky we have, a high degree of political freedom relative to the whole of history. We may feel like it's still not enough, but relative to the whole of history, we're pretty fortunate. But that could go. It might not last. But there's another kind of freedom, something that we can build every single moment of every day, and something that can never be taken from us. And that is the freedom from our own compulsions. Freedom from anger. Freedom from fear. Freedom from craving. Freedom from reactivity. Freedom from the sense of being a victim of circumstance. Victim of others. That's a good kind of freedom, and that's something that we have agency over, that we can cultivate, we can build. And it's relevant. When we expand that zone of freedom, we are building our own resilience. I think it's naive to think that to conceptualize healing as going from a state of suffering to a state of no suffering. everything's fine, all I experience is bliss. That's naive. It's not going to happen. Sorry. Bad news. Just ain't going to happen. Because even if for a moment you think like, but maybe I could be completely liberated, me. That thing that you call me doesn't even exist. What's the use of you being liberated if others still suffer? You think you won't feel it? You think you don't already feel it? What we call our suffering is already the suffering of the world. We already feel it in every pore of our beings. So, if the objective is to end all suffering, a lot of work ahead of us. It's not just ours, it's the whole world. And then, well, there's the cosmos too. It's going to take a while. So there's an alternative. And when I first encountered the sutras and the practice, I kept coming across this word equanimity. And I didn't find it very appealing, honestly. I thought it's kind of dull and wasn't very drawn to equanimity. It sounded a bit like indifference, to be honest. But there's a big difference. There's a big, big difference between equanimity and indifference. So, what if healing or even happiness is the ability to accept, to embrace, to be with suffering. It doesn't go away. But you no longer need to be pushed around by it. You can bear it with grace, with dignity. And you can even find that awareness of suffering, what does it bring? It brings compassion. It's the natural response. And there's more dignity in that. And it's more human, and it's anything but indifferent. Life still happens. There are ups and downs. Things go your way sometimes, they don't go your way other times. But if you can be with all of that, without going up and down with it, but calmly accepting, and not passively. Right? It doesn't mean just, okay, whatever happens. It's not that. But it's not getting shoved around by these, I just don't like that feeling, by the discomfort. So we increase our ability to be with the discomfort. And how? By expanding. By being vast, by seeing that actually the discomfort is small, relatively. Relative to what we really are, it is minute. Sometimes we need help to remember. Last night I needed help from a friend. It can happen that when you have to give a talk to 1,500 people, some anxiety comes up, And what happens? You contract around that anxiety and why do I have to do this? I don't know what to say. What do I know about healing? I'm a broken, I've got nothing to offer. That can happen. But luckily we have brothers and sisters, friends. You can call a friend. And they help us to expand again and remember. It's okay. Yes, in the limited terms of my own personal narrative, I may feel like I'm not enough. That's the truth. But that's just a story. And if I can let go of that story And remember, Tai is with me. My ancestors are with me. I don't have to do this alone. My brothers and sisters are with me. The earth is with me. Then it becomes possible again to sit here and share with you. So we want to be able to embrace the sorrow, embrace our grief and our pain. I give you one more quote from this wonderful book, which I highly recommended, which is The Field Guide to Climate Anxiety by Sarah Jaquette Ray. She says, embracing grief and decline is not a morose, fatalistic orientation. Facing death, the planet's and our own, opens us up to the love that is necessary in order to sustain the work of climate action. Facing death, the planet's and our own, opens us up to the love that is necessary in order to sustain the work of climate action. And we have to remember that what we are doing here in this retreat, what we will do when we go and practice walking meditation, is relevant. It connects to that bigger picture of climate action. It is highly, highly relevant, because in every step, with every step that we can take in freedom, we are cultivating this strength, this resilience, this freedom. Freedom to say no, freedom to say stop to our own impulses of reactivity, to our own compulsions of desire, of wanting to cover up, of wanting to avoid, of wanting to procrastinate. And that is a step taken individually but also collectively. We are not separate, we support each other, we go as a Sangha, and every step taken like that resonates out infinitely. We have a role to play, and we can cultivate that kind of freedom. Then we have something to offer. We can really help. And that help is needed. And it will be needed more and more in the coming decades.